Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat learning session with TBA rabbinic intern Chayva Lehrman.
This week, am going to take a bit of a departure from the norm. We're not going to look at Parshat Naso. It's my last opportunity to be here on a Saturday afternoon teaching, and that's sad and precious. I will be starting as the Rabbi of Congregation Am Tikva in San Francisco.
Is it San Francisco itself?
Oh, shade.
Is it in San Francisco itself?
It is in San Francisco itself. It's around the corner from the SF State. So it's like...
fundraiser right at the commissary.
Thank you so much. Oh, amazing. That sounds great. Well, we'll talk. So that said, one of the things I did outside of my time at Beth this year was work on my rabbinic thesis. And I wanted to bring some of that to this space and to have a chance to share it with you. And so before we jump into the text, let me give you a bit of framing both on the thesis, why I did it, and the material that we're going to be looking at today. So my thesis was a Jewish annotation of a section of the 4th chapter of the Quran. And what I mean by that is taking a section and saying, how can we look at this from a Jewish lens, find the points of connection, view it in the right context. It's a very different sort of scripture than Tanakh is. So what are the right genres and modes in which to read it? And how can we do this in a way that feels honest, not apologetic, and also informative, right? So that we can say, like, we can look at it with clear eyes and perhaps understand it in a more direct personal way. Because I know that before I started being interested in this sort of material, I had never cracked open a Quran, and I didn't feel very comfortable doing so because, I'd heard a lot about it and I didn't have much reference or like direct experience. My interest in this originally came from my experiences in Israel and feeling like, wow, I'm traveling through this country and I love it, and I don't understand all the street signs. Like, there's this language here that's totally impervious to me. And how could I understand this place better if I could speak this language that's also represented in this space? And so that was an experience I had in late high school. And so then I ended up studying Arabic in college after I'd kind of maxed out on all of my options for Hebrew. I took as much Hebrew as I could. And then they were like, okay, you need to start something new. So I said, okay, great. This is my chance to learn Arabic. So I had done that work back in college, took a break from my 20s, and then at the end of my rabbinical school year said, I'd love to reconnect to that from a rabbinic lens and see what this looks like now. So I spent the last year working with Rabbi Reuven Firestone, who's my dear advisor, whom some of you know, and this is really his field of expertise. So it was an incredible honor and opportunity to be able to study with him. So that's me approaching this, and it would be I think there aren't very many texts that try to do this sort of annotation of Quran, but there's a great resource called the Jewish Annotated New Testament, if you want that version, by Amy Jill Levine. So this is kind of the same style of project, but for the Quran instead of the New Testament. Okay, any questions or reactions? Just like really, okay. Okay, so we're gonna keep moving because there's a lot to cover. So things to think about when I was doing my annotation, I focused on, linguistic connections. So Quran, how we call often Tanakh, we call Hamikra, same root as Quran. That Kuf Resh Aleph root is the same in both languages. It means like a call or something spoken or recited. So it started as an oral medium, right? It started as an oral text. So I was looking at the linguistic connections like that, mythological connections, which is part of what we'll look at today, legal connections and contrast, which is the other thing we'll look at today. And I was specifically focusing on the 4th chapter. There's a lot of gender law in the 4th chapter. And so I specifically, and I ended up talking a lot about inheritance law. So what we'll get to today is first an origin myth for heterosexual partnership, and then we'll get to the inheritance law section. Now, last introductory note is that when you're looking at Quranic text, remember that it's all prophetic. It's all prophetic language, right? So think of how when you read Nevi'im, how like Heschel said the pitch is an octave too high, right? That Nevi'im are in a sense always shouting. They're trying to get a message through, and all the material in Quran is prophetic material. So you can read it with that. That's how somebody, you'd say a confessionist, like that's how somebody who is Muslim would receive this, is that it's a directive. The other thing is that Islam started in the 7th century. So relative to Jewish text, we already had all of Tanakh and the canon had closed, right? The New Testament had also come along, right? But Jewishly, we're already past Mishnah and into Midrash and starting Talmud, right? Or like into Talmud. So we have a lot of oral material that is dominant in the Jewish world, in addition to the written material of Tanakh. Yeah, okay. So often when people look at the evolution and contrasting the evolution of Abrahamic scriptures, they think their first instinct is to go, okay, well, this was developed off of this, and this was developed off of this, everything from what came before it. But actually, the more accurate way to look at Quran is to think of it as being influenced by all that oral material. So when we're reading our first text here, we'll read this first verse, this first ayah, and then contrast it with Midrash, not with Tanakh. So because that's more contemporaneous to it, that's what would have been floating around as, in among the Jews of the Hijaz, of the Arabian Peninsula. Okay. Any questions on introduction or framing? Yes. Yeah. Oh, no, this is my language, and it's not exclusively separate from marriage. It's actually, who is they? They're yes. Okay, so this specific verse does not specify marriage, but marriage is a dominant concept in the Quran. Yes. In fact, in the legal material on inheritance, we'll get into what the wife receives from the estate. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so let's dive in. So the first text that we're going to look at is origin of heterosexual marriage, and so this here is the very first ayah, which means symbol or sign, but also can mean verse, of the 4th chapter of the Quran. So could somebody read this in English, please? Joey, go ahead.
O mankind, be conscious of your Lord, who created you from one soul divided from its fellow, and from them spread many men and women. Be conscious of God, from whom you request rights and family relations. Indeed, God has been watching over you. Thank you.
Okay, so how do you understand this origin myth as it's outlined here? If you were to say write a script or outline a script for a movie or a montage sequence, like what would it look like? Can you describe the scene?
I see parallels to Adam and Eve in this one.
Okay, parallels to Adam and Eve. How so?
Because the first man and woman, respectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First man and woman and partners.
Right.
Yeah. Man and woman. Yes. Yeah. Similar. We have the Pru or Vu parallel of like this should be a fruitful, productive partnership of many children.
But different to me, it seems, because God is the dominant one.
Creates and
both
together at the same time, right? So it's more Genesis 2 than 1.
So there's one, and then he does, and it's very general, unless later on there's a story with this.
This specific model appears a few times, but it doesn't have any narrative attached. It's just this.
It doesn't. This is it.
Yeah. Yes.
No questions asked.
No questions asked. God is above. And I want to specifically pull out what you said around created at the same time and split. Just naming that. Okay, Sandra?
Yeah, rather than...
Yes, that is quite different. And is anyone familiar with, without turning the page, a midrash that might have something to do with this or might sound similar? Is it something you've heard before? Yeah, Alan?
Created man and woman androgynously. It's like is one soul. They were together, and it was from that everything split off, which is very similar to what's going on right here.
Great. So can you read our next section, please? Turn the page and read it in English.
And God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness." Rabbi Yirmiyahu ben Elazar said, In the hour when the Holy One created the first human, God created him as an androgyny, as it is said, male and female God created them. Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani said, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, God created him with two faces, dupard trufin, and sawed him and made him backs, a back here and a back there. They responded to him, but it says, God took one of his ribs. He said to them, it means from one of his sides, just as you would say, and for the side of the tabernacle, which they translate in Aramaic for the side.
Yes. Yes, tsela means side, and we often translate it as rib, but it can also mean side in this other context. And so the rabbi saw that and said, oh, well, this sounds like this origin story, right? And wrote it as midrash with an ayin. Yeah.
This is the first time.
Marshall, do you want to use the microphone?
Conscious of your Lord who created you from one soul, divided from its fellow. So there's no element here of what it seems to be some kind of a spiritual creation.
That's a great point, that there isn't a physicality in the Quran version of this story, right? But in the Midrash, it is very physical. It's like your body divided. Yeah. Now let's look also, and then we can reflect back on all three together. There is a non-religious space in which this, there's eyes lit up, yes, in which this same story comes up. And this is really interesting for me to start looking at all the different ways that this story gets told in our tradition and in others. So in Plato's Symposium, there is a section called The Speech of Aristophanes. And it's a philosophical statement on eros, on sexual love, and so the way it's described, at least by Dover here, is once upon a time, all human beings were double creatures, each with 2 heads, 2 bodies, and 8 limbs. Then, by the command of Zeus, each double creature was cut in half, and so humans as we know them came into being. Every one of us seeks his other half, and this is the search of eros. If we are pious, we may hope to be rewarded by the search. If we are impious, Zeus may cut us in 2 again, and each of us will be like a flat fish or figure in relief. A lot of flat fish out there, but there's always more fish in the sea, so it's okay. So how does it feel to see the Midrash kind of sandwiched by these 2 stories in context? We're not attributing one as being the true original here. I want to make that really clear. Does it change how you view the Midrash beyond putting it in the context of we're all trying to explain what we see? I think, so Plato would have come first as far like temporally. I think that, I'll tell you what, I think that sometimes there's a feeling of, when we make our texts academic like this, we pull the heart and soul out of them. And I worry about that in this sort of study, because you can say, this is just a story made up by people, and like it's, it goes back to, Plato preceded it, therefore we must have gotten it from Plato or from Greco-Roman culture, which doesn't always feel very good, right? But I would add that I think Sandra's exactly on point, that there's an element of holiness in like the shared search and the shared truth, that we are all seeking to understand this, and like origin myths are one of humanity's ways to like give meaning and get meaning from life. And so to say, there is a deep origin to the love I have with my partner, and that is that comes from something before either of us met, is that's really meaningful, and that matters. Like, that's very valid. That's not, it's holy. Exactly. So when I look at all these different texts, I think that we're all accessing something that is true and holy in different ways. Let's move on, because we don't have much time, but we're not going to read the entirety of the next 2 texts. because they're very long, especially the second one. I'm going to give some framing and just move us through this to teach it rather than we'll have a moment to explore it at the end. The first text here, where it says Surat An-Nisa 4:7, this is a verse that says that you must make a bequest to the people around you when you pass away. You must give a will, and the will is, there is a portion for the men, and then there's a portion for the women, and whether it's a lot or a little, there's a required portion. This is one of the most egalitarian inheritance verses in the Quran. And what's really interesting is that this is the model for the Shiite inheritance system. That's what it tends toward, is basically a gender equal distribution model entirely premised upon proximity of relationship to the deceased. Turn the page. It is progressive, yeah. So in looking at Jewish comparative material to think like, how, if we're starting in a Jewish place, where would we go with this? Well, I didn't expect to encounter inheritance law when I started reading this chapter of the Quran. So I had to go and learn the Jewish inheritance law in order to make sure that I knew what I was comparing. A lot of it comes up in Mishnah Bava Batra in chapter 8. And here's an interesting one where it says the son and the daughter, it says echad haben ve'echad habat banachala. So like there is both son and daughter in the inheritance, right? Like one for one, implying that perhaps they are alike in what they receive. And then it immediately contradicts it, which the Talmud, we didn't have time to go into here, but there's an extensive discussion where there are 4 rabbinic theories on what does it mean that it says that, echad haben ve'echad habat, and then immediately goes into, but the son takes a double portion. You're like, well, okay, what does that mean? Yeah, Alan?
Firstborn son.
Firstborn son, yes. Firstborn son takes a double portion. Interesting side note, biblical law gives the firstborn son the double portion. Rabbinic law does not have the double portion model. It has a lot more attention given to women and like wives and daughters in what they inherit. And land is privatized and can be distributed regardless of tribe, which is very different from what we see in, say, the daughters of Zelophehad's story in Numbers, right? Where they argue for their inheritance, but then their marriages must be within their own tribe so that you don't misdistribute the land that God has designated for each tribe. Very important in Torah, less so in Mishnah. And so there's this academic who at JTS, Milgram, who says like it's probably drawing more on the Greco-Roman legal system that had privatized land and equal distribution regardless of gender. So, okay, so that's the Mishnah Bava Batra 8:4. But then a few verses later in the Quran, we get something entirely different. Flip the page. We're now on the third to last page. It should say 4:11 through 12 if you're following online. And I'm not going to read through all of this because it's a bit brain breaky. There's actually a quote in the oral tradition of Islam that says that Muhammad said that studying the laws of inheritance is half of all knowledge because there's so much. He doesn't say this. That's the quote. And the assumption is there's so much math in it that like the algebra as a word came from Arabic because Islamic scholars are trying to figure out how to do all the math to distribute inheritance. So we end up with this sort of thing. For the boys, equivalent of 2 girls, but if there's 2 women, then they receive 2/3 of inheritance. If there's only 1, then she gets half. So it breaks it down exactly by like how many of each gender, by what degree of separation, and then what are the fractions that each one of them should receive. And among all of this is always the caveat that a wife is sustained on 1/8 of her husband's estate. Yes, 1/8. So this is much more mathematical, much less gender equitable. This is the basis for Sunni inheritance law. Very different system from Shia. Yeah. So, and in legal terms, we would say this is intestate succession, right? It does, like testate succession means you have a last will and testament. you decide for yourself how you're going to distribute everything. Intestate means you don't get to decide. There's a very clear, like, you are told by the state or by the religion, this is how your property will be divided. And so it's a different model. And we have that too in Judaism, right? So two psukim before, or two mishnayot before, before what we read before, we have this. The order for inheritance is this. If a man dies and he has no son, he should pass his inheritance to his daughter. Fine, that's from the story of daughters of Tzlofachad. But then this is if a son precedes a daughter, and then descendants of the son precede a daughter, and daughter precedes the brothers, and descendants of a daughter precede the brothers. And we have kind of a similar thing. The exact division is different. Also, you'll note that there isn't a sense of exactly what fraction each relative is given in this. It's only order of precedence. But it was interesting to see these two different models, and we're almost out of time. But are there any, so thank you for going with me on this fast and wild ride through sections of my thesis. And I would love to hear from you any questions you have about the material, or just on undertaking a project like this and why it would be important. Yeah, Gary. Yeah, I don't think it's ever explained in the text. Like Jews, Muslims have an interpretive tradition that is premised upon scholarly authority, and actually very similar hermeneutical principles of, like, if you interpret something and there's strong consensus around your opinion, it will hold more weight than otherwise. I didn't get a chance to read all of that for this thesis, so I couldn't tell you exactly what the dominant opinions are. But the idea is that women are generally not employed in the society in which this originated, and so they would be dependent upon men's wealth in order to be sustained. And it's similar in Judaism in that, like think about when Boaz marries Naomi, and he says, now he does it in order to now be the owner of the material that she's been guardian of in the meantime, right? So she's not being sustained on a portion, but she's also not inheriting her husband's wealth, right? She's holding it until she finds a new husband. So, well, I think that, yeah, women could not hold the entirety of their husband's estates in either system. And why 1/8 specifically, I don't know, but it couldn't be a majority because she then would become a landowner, and there needed to be a certain amount distributed to the sons and daughters. Right. This is a good question. How is the widow supported? Because it's not articulated here. There are other sections of this same chapter that that do address what the widow would inherit. It's not a majority. I'm trying to remember exactly what, like, I'm not remembering what the exact number is, and I'll defer to the rabbis in the room. I will defer to the other rabbis in the room. Is that okay? Okay. I'm just going to repeat that for the folks on Zoom, which is that the widows were guaranteed sustenance by the estate of their husbands, but they would not inherit from them. Yeah. What's the guarantee of sustenance? Who defines it? Yeah, there's her living expenses, that she wouldn't be thrown out on the street, food, clothing. Yeah, there's a lot of commentary on that. Marshall? By the time he was giving prophecy, more like 670, 680. Yeah, that's earlier. So that would be like 4th century. The question was one of clarification of the timeline, and that there would have been several hundred years of midrash before we get to Quranic text. Also remember, there were Jews, I didn't write on this section, but there were Jews that the early Muslim converts interacted with, or even tried to convert from. So if I get to continue this project, like, that'll obviously be an area of interest to write on those dynamics, which are sometimes good and sometimes bad, and some of those texts are interesting to read and some of them are uncomfortable. And, this is what happens. We have different religions, and we don't want to pretend like they're not uncomplicated in how they intersect sometimes.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.